Good evening, everyone. I'm Kelly Gallatley, Director of the Ian Potter Museum of Art here at the University of Melbourne, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's forum, Aftermath, Environmental and Human Intervention. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional people of the land on which the university stands, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to this multidisciplinary event where art, earth sciences, geology, politics and policy collide. Tonight's forum came about in response to artist Susan Norrie's latest work, Aftermath, in which she documents the Liu Lucy Mud Volcano's decade-long eruption in Indonesia. This forum will investigate environmental disasters and disaster prevention, management and mitigation in response to and alongside Susan's work. The exhibition in which that work premieres, Susan Norrie Fieldwork 2006-2016, is on at the Potter at the moment, and if you haven't seen it, I hope tonight will inspire you to do so. And if you have, you'll have seen it already, you'll no doubt want to go back. It's the sixth in the Potter's series of Vizard Foundation Contemporary Artist Projects, which is a really important creative initiative of the Vizard Foundation, which provides a grant to mid-career or senior artists and inspires them, actually encourages them to make new work and to really push in their practice, and Susan has certainly done that with Aftermath. Susan will be joined this evening by Dr. Lisa Palmer, Senior Lecturer in Geography here at the University of Melbourne, who will discuss the challenges of combining customary and modern water governance in post-disaster areas. And Lisa will be followed by Associate Professor Mark Quigley, an active research scientist in earth sciences, who will discuss how humans are altering seismological processes. This forum will be convened this evening by Associate Professor Peter Christoff from the School of Geography. And it's my pleasure to introduce Peter and hand over to him now. Associate Professor Peter Christoff will be known to many of you, no doubt. He's a political scientist teaching and researching in climate and environmental policy in the School of Geography. He's currently a board member of the Australian Conservation Foundation and was Vice President for 8 years. He was also formerly a member of the Victorian Premier's Climate Change Reference Group and a member of the Victorian Ministerial Reference Council on Climate Change Adaptation, and also recently the Assistant Commissioner for the Environment in Victoria. His recent publications include the books 4 Degree of Global Warming, Australia in a Hot World, and Globalisation and the Environment, which he produced with Professor Robin Eckersley. Can you join me in welcoming Peter Christoff?
Thanks very much, Kerry. I should say that those gloomy sorts of introductions really depress people. The one thing that I'm very proud of is that I'm actually now also associated with a small group called Climart. I'm on the board of Climart, which is actually looking at the problem of how one does art in relation to climate change. And I think that has some relevance to tonight's discussions as well. We had a very interesting forum earlier this week, which sort of introduced some of the topics and issues and questions I think we're going to be dealing with tonight. Quickly to move on to the next slide, you'll notice that this is an explosive start, and we're now moving on, I think, to what I should be doing, which is channeling you and piping you towards the speakers as fast as possible. The three topics tonight seem to be quite disparate, but in fact they're not. I think they're bound together very interestingly in a range of different ways. Firstly, the topic tonight is about the aftermath of environmental and human intervention. And it just draws to mind, I think, the problem of the Anthropocene, which I think overwrites, shapes many of these sorts of discussions now. There's a question of human agency. Is it environmental? Is it environmental? Is it human? And I think this is really central to the sort of work that Susan has been doing, and also the problem that she looks at, namely the mud volcano, which is central to her current and recent works, but also to the works of Lisa and Mark. There's a dialogue that is occurring around agency, which is a puzzling one, and I think a problematic one that'll last well through the 21st century. There's also a very interesting puzzle, which I think we'll be talking about tonight, which is how very different types of disciplines, art and artistic creation, science and ethnography, focus the environment, and in particular on disaster? How do very different languages and different approaches capture and talk to these issues? What sort of dialogue occurs between these different types of disciplines? What differences do they bring to the problem that they're trying to address? There are also tensions, I think, between these different disciplines and within them. There's an issue of ethical engagement. How do the arts, artistic creation, science, ethnography talk about disaster? What do they lose in terms of talking about catastrophe? Does catastrophe become sort of marginalised, pushed to the outside of their concerns, or does it become an even more intense ethical focus? There's a tension between the ethic and the aesthetic dimensions, in particular in the world of art. So all of these things, I think, will come to the fore in discussion, and I'm hoping that we will have a very vibrant discussion when we've heard from the speakers. What we're going to do is to hear from the three speakers, and I want to introduce all of them now in sequence. First, we'll hear from Susan Norrie. I think the second speaker is actually Mark, is that right? Mark, and then Lisa. Susan is, I think, well known to all of you. She has been very prominent in the Australian art scene. Originally trained as a painter in the National Art School in Sydney and then the National Gallery School in Melbourne in the 1970s. She's shifted over the last decades towards the use of film and installation, and since the 1990s has produced some very important works, more recently including Undertow in 2002, Havoc, which was the first look at the problem of the mud volcano, and then of course her most recent work, which Kelly's introduced. Susan's work has been shown very widely. Selected solo exhibitions include at the Potter Museum, the University of Melbourne currently. I'd recommend everyone go and see it if you haven't already. At the Edinburgh International Festival in Edinburgh in 2009. Very importantly, the Biennale, the Venice Biennale in 2007. She's also been part of selected group exhibitions, the Montreal Biennale, the Jewish Museum in New York, the Biennale of Sydney in 2014, Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego. She has a profound and extraordinary international career. She's well respected overseas and here. Susan will be followed by Associate Professor Mark Quigley, who's an earthquake scientist in the School of Earth Sciences here at Melbourne University, the recipient of several prestigious awards, including the New Zealand Prime Minister's Prize for Science Communication and also the Geological Society of America Public Service Award. He's well known for his intellectual work, his publications, over 65 scientific papers and technical reports. He's presented very widely in public scientific talks around the world and is featured in 8 documentaries, including the award-winning film When a City Falls. This is where, as someone who spends more of his time with theoretical and conceptual work, myself, becomes extremely jealous. He also has here that his earthquake-related research has spanned the globe with field research in New Zealand, Mexico, Tibet, Timor-Leste, Iran, Antarctica, the United States and outback Australia. Nice work if you can get it. Thanks, Mark. Mark will be followed by Lisa Palmer, my colleague in geography. She's a senior lecturer in geography here, a human geographer who teaches and researches human environment relations and Indigenous approaches to environmental and social governance. Her research takes a critical ecological approach and is focused on Southeast Asia and Indigenous Australia. She's done some wonderful work in her doctoral research on the making of Kakadu National Park, and her postdoctoral work has also included work on new approaches to treaty and agreement between Indigenous peoples and others in Australia and other settler states. And in recent years, she's done some fabulous work in East Timor, Timor-Leste, examining the intersection of custom and modernity in the diverse governance approaches of this new state, and that'll be the focus of her work. I think it's derived in part from her recent book, Water Politics and Spiritual Ecology. So what I'd like to do now is welcome Susan. Each of the speakers will speak for 15 minutes. At the end of that, I think what would be useful would be to see if there's a dialogue between them, see what they want to say to each other about their works, and then I'll open the floor for more general discussion. So it's my great pleasure to call Susan to take over from me. Thank you.
I'm going to speak left of field, which I always do. I'm not going to begin completely in relationship to the Lucy Mud Volcano. I'm going to begin with the research that I began in 2004 at the Japanese Aerospace Agency, which has been in operation since the 1960s. Satellites launched from Tanegashima have been specifically designed to monitor world weather patterns, environmental disasters, man-made and natural, greenhouse gases, security networks, defense systems, and other communication satellites. Going back to Indonesia, almost a decade after filming Havoc, my moving image project for the Venice Biennale in 2007, based on the Lucy Mud Volcano, wasn't something that came out of the blue. It was an extension of my ongoing relationship with Japan. Since the Venice Biennale, I have been working with a Japanese team and have had made a series of short films in Japan and on the Russian oil and gas island Sakhalin, which is north of Hokkaido, Japan. Prior to that first trip to Indonesia in 2006, I had been exploring possible projects with contacts at JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, as a way of expanding my focus on environmental issues. In fact, as part of the development of my work for the 52nd Venice Biennale in 2007, I received support from the Australia Council of the Arts in 2006 to travel to Japan to visit the Japanese Space Center on the island of Tanegashima on the East China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Further development of my proposed project became impossible because of the unease created in the region with the North Koreans and their controversial missile program. I was advised by JAXA that accessibility to the Aerospace Agency would be impossible under the circumstances as the situation was highly volatile. In fact, in October 2006, the North Koreans detonated an underground nuclear bomb. I have always been interested in natural and man-made disasters. In January 2006, JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Agency, launched the Daiichi ALOS Advanced Land Observing Satellite, which has the capacity to monitor global environmental changes. The major objectives of Daiichi are to update maps for Japan and other countries, especially those in the Asia-Pacific region, to carry out regional observation to help ensure that development is in harmony with environment, to monitor large-scale disasters around the world, and finally to survey natural resources in Japan and other countries. The top priority during development was cartography and regional observation, but since then these have been replaced by disaster surveying. Daiichi is contributing on an international level with quick and accurate observations of the Earth. On the 29th of May 2006, a mud volcano eruption occurred from an oil and gas exploration site in Porong, Sidoarjo, East Java, Indonesia. Both JAXA, Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, and the Disaster Prevention Institute at Kyoto University in Japan monitored the Lucy Mud Volcano and the ground subsidence in the vicinity of the Lucy eruptive vent was well recorded by the Daiichi satellite from the 19th of May 2006 onwards, which is in fact yesterday. This research is conducted under the agreement of JAXA Research. The ownership of PALSA data belongs to METI, which is a Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and JAXA. So a lot of this information, this data, wasn't sort of available till much later, which is, I think, fascinating. In the field of satellites, the relationship between Japan and Asian countries started in 1988. Since then, JAXA has increased its cooperative partners in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Indonesia. I had the opportunity in 2013 to interview Professor Masato Eguchi from the Disaster Prevention Institute and Director of the Sakurajima Research Center in 2013. As I had attended 6 environmental satellite launches at the Japanese Aerospace Center and had interviewed numerous scientists in Japan since 2009 and given the Fukushima nuclear disaster, an obvious focus for me was Sakurajima and the fact that it's about 50 kilometers away from the Sendai nuclear power plant. I discovered that Masato Eguchi's initial research and interest in methane gases had led to an interest in volcanology, an interest in methane gases had led to an interest in volcanology, which in turn became an ongoing monitoring of the Asia-Pacific region, especially the increased seismic activity around Sakurajima. Professor Masato's voice and his Professor Masato Eguchi's voice in his interview was used in my film Rules of Play, which was screened at the Montreal Biennale in 2014. In June 2015, I organised a return to Japan and met up with him without my Japanese cameraman and his assistant. I realised Masato Eguchi understood and spoke English much better than I had previously thought. This time, our purpose was to dig a bit deeper about Sakurajima and its location, and soon our conversation shifted to the communities and their coexistence with the mountain. He admitted that he felt a deep responsibility about his 30 years working as a volcanologist monitoring Sakurajima and the importance of this research for the million people who live in the surrounding area. While he is involved in disaster prevention and management, he is equally concerned with his role as an informant to the government or the Bureau of Meteorology to ensure that data was readily available at any given moment. This time we got around to discussing Fukushima and man-made disasters. Not only did he admit that he thought Fukushima was a man-made disaster, but that the Lucy Mud Volcano in East Java was a man-made disaster as well. He indicated to me that the Japanese scientific community were always aware of this from the beginning of the Lucy Mud Volcano rupture. Masato Oguchi, as a volcanologist, travels to Indonesia regularly. He is also a key contributor to a Japanese initiative for joint international research focusing on particular environmental issues, the Science and Technology Research Partnership for Sustainable Development, SATREP, another disaster management team he's been involved with for many years. During the interview, he suggested I attend one of their workshops that would take place in Yogyakarta later that year, November 2015. It would be a joint Indo-Japanese forum focused specifically on volcanoes and especially on Mount Merapi, an active volcano located near the border between Central Java and Yogyakarta, which had erupted in May 2006 and considered by many as a possible trigger for the Lucy Mud Volcano disaster. This workshop forum was a turning point for me in regard to the connections between my interest in Japan and my work in East Java. Given the relative proximity, I then planned to revisit the Lucy Mud Volcano. I wanted to see what had happened to the people and their land, their homes and their livelihood. Returning to Lucy was strange. Everything was so familiar, but at the same time it wasn't. When I was there in 2006, 2007, people were really struggling with the devastation. The mud flow was unique and unpredictable. The management of the mud flow was chaotic at the time. I rang Dr. Mark Quigley from Curtin University, Australia, in 2015. He is a geological pressure and rock mechanics expert and has always claimed that the Lucy Mud Volcano was created by the drilling as the lower part of the borehole was not protected by casing. Dr. Quigley suggested I get in contact with Dr. Hardy Presetto, chairman of BPLS, a government agency that had been formed in 2008 to manage all aspects of the Lucy Mud Volcano. Hardy gave me permission to film the men dredging the mud from the dikes into the Perong River. As I had argued, these images represented management and mitigation of the mud volcano. The men who work 7 days a week, 10 or so hours a day, constantly dredging, are cleaning up the mess of greed, mismanagement, exploitation, and ignorance. At the time, and indeed since, there have been many options about what caused the massive rupture. I agree with those who think it was directly related to inadequate exploration procedures undertaken by Lapindo Brantas, the Indonesian oil and gas company in control of the drilling, and Santos, the Australian company who were their partners at the time. Lucy was something that continues to haunt me, so returning was an attempt at some kind of resolution, both personally and because I felt the project was unfinished. The aim of presenting Havoc in Venice was to represent to a wider audience the power of human resilience. I hope with Aftermath I have done that again. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Susan. Mark.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for your attendance. It's nice to see such a packed house. Human agency in earthquakes, a challenging topic. It makes the news somewhere on the planet almost every day. It transcends national borders and it also transcends tectonic environments. So whether you live in the middle of a continent like in Australia or in the eastern United States, or whether you live in a plate boundary like New Zealand, it is an issue that we are starting to learn more about, starting to think more about, and scrutinize. To the point now when a big earthquake occurs somewhere, there almost always is some sort of theory that we might have had some role to play on it. The thing is, we've been having earthquakes on planet Earth for many billions of years, actually. It's a natural consequence of plate tectonics. And so some of the examples I'm going to show you today are kind of at the fringes of the leading edge of science. So we're trying to understand, is there a human agency in some of these events? And my perspective, I used to be at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. I was there for 7 years as a professor in the geology department. I was one of the chief scientists involved in the earthquake sequence there, and I see some parallels with the LUSI situation and some of the things that we went through in Christchurch. 12,000 people were displaced in eastern Christchurch as a result of silt bubbling up from beneath the ground, causing land damage that was not able to be repaired in a timely fashion. And so we, and I use that phrase because I was one of the residents that lived in eastern Christchurch, we were moved on from that land. And now the New Zealand government is the unfortunate owners of some very marginal land in eastern Christchurch. That's quite a challenge for future sea level rise and all sorts of problems. So the photos there, this is a photo that I took immediately after the Christchurch earthquake, showing flooding, extensive flooding of the urban environment there as a result of the earthquakes. So life aboard our tectonic conveyor belt. Australia is one of the fastest moving continents in the world, actually. We move closer to Papua New Guinea about 7 centimeters every year. We don't feel that because we're all moving together, but that's about the rate at which we move. We're being pulled forward by subduction. This giant subduction zone here, which was the source of the 2004 Sumatran earthquake and giant tsunami, but also LUSI has a role to play in that. LUSI's right along that plate boundary there. Christchurch along the other plate boundary here, where the plates are sliding side by side with one another and converging as well, creating the Southern Alps. So we're in a complicated stress field here where we're being pushed on by Papua New Guinea and pushed on by New Zealand and pushed on by the Himalayas, and we're being pulled by this subduction zone, and it creates this complex situation. As a result of that, we have lots of earthquakes in Australia, lots of small ones, not by New Zealand or Japanese standards, of course, but by intraplate standards, we have quite a few. And this just gives you an idea, I'm standing in front of it, gives you an idea of where our seismicity is. It's not just a shotgun pattern. There are areas that concentrate more earthquakes than others. Certainly the Flinders Ranges in South Australia and parts of the highlands in Victoria have more earthquakes than other parts like the Nullarbor, for instance. We understand earthquakes very well, and we have understood them quite well for a long time at the basic level, the basic physics of earthquakes. So we know that tectonic plate movement exerts stresses throughout the crust. And if we think about my little cartoon here, we have a fault sitting in the crust. The stresses act on that fault as the plates move. Eventually, the stresses overcome the strength of the fault, and it ruptures. And that energy that it releases in the form of seismic energy is what an earthquake actually is. It's the rupture, the release of energy from a fault rupture. And then at the end of the situation, in this case here, we've had a displacement of a few meters. The cycle starts again. We call that the seismic cycle, and it's a wonderful way of just understanding the basics of earthquake. My little graph here shows what I call the residual stress and the failure stress acting on a fault. And so you have this kind of scenario where stresses gradually get loaded up on the fault, and when it reaches some sort of level, it fails, the stress drops back down in the earthquake, and then the cycle starts again. Now, we'd be able to predict earthquakes, of course, if life was this simple. We'd just say, oh, it's been several thousand years since the last one, but we know it ruptures like clockwork. Every 10,000 years, our delta T here. But unfortunately, faults are not so well behaved. Sometimes, like number 4 here, they rupture too soon at a lower failure stress than we might have predicted. Sometimes they have a whole bunch of small earthquakes before the big earthquake that get us quite nervous. The L'Aquila incident was one of these sort of events. Sometimes they rupture at the failure stress, but they don't have as big of an earthquake as we thought they might have. Sometimes other faults increase or decrease the stresses acting on a fault and push that that earthquake closer together in time or further apart. And sometimes rather than having one big earthquake, it fails in a whole series of smaller ones. So that's what keeps me busy and keeps me up at night, that sort of issue. Here's a photograph I took of what a fault rupture looks like. This is one of the most beautiful photographs I've ever taken, not only because it captures the elements of an earthquake with such a vivid expression, also captured by the sheep here. This is a New Zealand photograph, so we have to have sheep in there for scale. But also it's featured in galleries, and it's kind of that nice hybrid blend of science and art. The more we learn about earthquakes, the more we realize that they can be triggered by a whole variety of processes. And this little cartoon here is one example of that. So we know, for instance, that sometimes in some parts of the world, tidal stresses exert influences on seismicity. We know when we melt glaciers, we change the stress field in the crust and we can increase earthquakes. We know that magma rising through volcanoes influences earthquakes. We know that creating dams influence earthquakes and mines influences earthquakes. We know that melting in the crust can influence earthquakes. But the most common cause of earthquakes is when a giant fault ruptures, it exerts stresses in the region, and that causes more earthquakes, what we call aftershocks, in the surrounding area. Sometimes earthquakes thousands of kilometers away can cause earthquakes in other places, and that's just shown by these seismic waves coming in here. And I think what gets mentioned a lot in this case of the Anthropocene and our influence on earthquakes is in this blow-up image down below here. The injection of fluids into the crust acts as a lubricant to faults and can cause them to fail. Almost all the time when we think that this sort of situation occurs, the faults are pre-existing, and they've had many, many earthquakes long before humans have had anything to do with them. However, there's some quite compelling evidence that we are having a bit of an effect in some places on the planet. The other thing, that's a direct thing, pumping wastewater into the crust can interact with faults, cause them to be lubricated, and can cause a failure at a lower stress level than we might have predicted. So bringing those earthquakes closer in time. The other way we can do that is by messing with the stresses in the crust, by either injecting fluids or withdrawing fluids, which can actually change the stress on faults and that interaction there. So the US has been doing a lot of monitoring of seismicity, and some of you are probably familiar with this. This is quite a now famous graph, not dissimilar from the global warming type scenarios. This shows a background rate of earthquakes, about 21 earthquakes per year above magnitude 3 in this particular area, and then a great increase in the earthquake rate around this time here, which is just when the practice of was beginning to proliferate more of injecting wastewater into these areas. So there's a clear connection that there is a background rate of seismicity, of course, but that human activity has had an influence on that seismicity rate in this particular part of the United States, in an intraplate area, central and eastern United States. And there's quite a compelling argument that can also be made. If you look behind me here, there was a magnitude 5.7 earthquake in Oklahoma in 2011, quite a large earthquake. An earthquake of that magnitude beneath Melbourne would cause many thousands of fatalities and lots of buildings to fall down. It would be a very bad scenario for us. This earthquake, people have argued that that earthquake was actually triggered by wastewater injection on a pre-existing fault, but that it was triggered by wastewater injection. There's a lot of discussion about fracking, and whenever I get asked about fracking, I bring up this beautiful, wonderful age-old relationship in earthquakes, which is that for every magnitude 6 earthquake, you get 10 magnitude 5s and 100 magnitude 4s and 1,000 magnitude 3s in a sequence. And it's that holds whether you look at global seismicity or whether you look at 30 years of earthquakes in Switzerland, or in this case, whether you look at the Canterbury earthquakes. And so the process of fracking, in essence, is what it's trying to do is create very, very small tensile fractures to create fluid pathways and gas pathways. And so when people talk about fracking, typically the kind of earthquakes that are being generated are magnitude 1s, which are very, very small earthquakes. And what I tell the people is, in order to actually strongly increase the chances of having a big, like a magnitude 5 or higher, you need to have lots and lots of thousands of magnitude 1s to have any sort of effect. So, for example, for a 1 magnitude 5 earthquake, we'd expect to have 10,000 magnitude 1s. So this is quite an interesting relationship. Influencing mountain growth. How can humans possibly have an influence on the uplift of mountains? Well, there's one particularly dramatic example of groundwater withdrawal. This is in California, in the San Joaquin Valley. And the brown colors here that hopefully a lot of you can see relate to groundwater change in a relatively short period of time, 100 years, where water is being withdrawn from this valley and used for a variety of purposes. What is most interesting about this is these red dots that surround this valley. And what they show is that the uplift rates of mountains most proximal to the areas of maximum water withdrawal in the basin are higher than other areas where the water withdrawal has not been so significant. So the authors of this particular paper argued that the uplift of mountains was in some way what we call an isostatic response to removing water from the basin. So humans influencing mountains. And then another interesting study that came out of Nature was looking at an earthquake in Spain, 9 fatalities, a damaging earthquake, which the authors, again, argued that it was related to groundwater withdrawal, in this case, that actually resulted in this earthquake occurring where it was, with the characteristics that it did. It was an active fault. It was a fault that had earthquakes in the past. But what these two colorful images show here is the slip distribution, the amount of slip on the fault in that earthquake, which is shown here. So the red colors are the most amount of slip and the directions of slip. And this is a model that basically says if we have this fault plane and we deplete the water here, this is the sort of maximum amount of stress change we'd expect on that fault from pulling that water out. Now, the authors argued that the slip distribution of the fault actually coincided with areas we'd expect to have been most stressed as a result of pulling the water out of this particular area. So, quite an interesting thing. We're beginning to act on the plate tectonic scale. This is just quite an interesting relationship here between the amount of heat loss on the planet from a result of radioactive decay of isotopes and the primordial heat left over from the formation of the Earth, compared to what our yearly energy usage is as a planet, and how much energy we use. I've got them both in terawatts there. So plate tectonics, that's the heat loss of the planet, this sort of energy heat loss of the planet. And actually, we're going to overtake that this century. So these are projected amounts of energy usage on the bottom here. We're down in this area here. But if we continue to increase our demand for energy the way we are at the moment, we're going to soon be operating at the scale of the planet, which is both scary and fascinating. Another interesting thing is, of course, we move more rock in Australia by ships than our rivers do by natural processes. The main way Australia erodes is by excavation and shipping. So that's quite an interesting relationship there. We export about more than 1,000 megatons of rock and coal, and our rivers move about 100 million tons per year. There's examples in New Zealand where we can look at landscapes that were once natural and had earthquake-induced effects, in this case, rockfalls, and compare the distributions of those rockfalls in the past with ones from the earthquakes. And what we've found is quite fascinating. So this is an example of some modern rocks that fell from mountains, traveled several hundred, in this case 700 meters down slope. Here is a bunch of modeling we've done of those sort of events. And we found lots of older rocks on those same landscapes. And when we compared the distributions of the modern ones, the pre-Anthropocene ones, they actually were deposited 6,000 years ago. We found that the boulders actually have the same sizes, they've got the same sort of lithologies, they've come from the same source cliff, but the modern ones have traveled 200 meters further, the most distal ones. So we've argued that actually, perhaps inadvertently, the combination of European and indigenous deforestation in this landscape allowed earthquakes to have a a further reach in terms of their damage and their impact than we would have recognized from the geologic record. We also have examples of where we've built things on the planet and they've influenced the patterns of liquefaction. In this case, the building of the rugby stadium, the home of the mighty Canterbury Crusaders, actually created its own effect in terms of the sinking of Christchurch. You can see the stadium, one of the stands here, sinking. So there are some natural processes, and then there's a human overprint on that. I want to close with just a couple photos of LUSI and a couple comments. So this is a Google Earth image. Anyone can download this, very easy to do. You can go look at LUSI on Google Earth, it's fascinating. And this is at 2006. And then this is an example, this is what it looks like at the 29th of May, 2015 is when I got this image here. So that's 2015, the previous one was 2006, and you can really see how it's changed. The most scientific evidence has been like the debate about whether it's natural or whether there was a human role has really bounced back and forth, I think, between the earthquake-induced origin and the drilling-induced origin. Perhaps we'll save this for the discussion as I'm out of time. But all I can say is that the stress modeling for the earthquake seems to have be unable to account for any sort of liquefaction effects, the natural side of things for inducing the mud to rupture there. So in the work that I've looked at, it seems to be that this is the preferred interpretation is that there was a major role of the inadequate measures in the drilling that caused the mud flow. So earthquakes are a natural consequence of plate tectonics. They almost always occur on pre-existing faults. We've had tens of thousands of earthquakes prior to human impact on the planet. They can be triggered by a variety of processes. We know that by influencing the hydrologic properties of the crust, we can trigger earthquakes. That's a given. And some recent earthquakes actually have been attributed to fluid injection. The strongest evidence at the moment points to a drilling cause for Lucy mud flow initiation. It's still being debated in the scientific literature, but certainly the strongest evidence points to that. Even in naturally triggered disasters around the planet, human activity has played a role in how they've been manifested. Okay, thank you. Get you to help.
No, we have not. Thanks very much, Mark. I think you've just shown us how humans can be moving and uplifting in all the wrong ways. Lisa.
Hi, everyone. And can I just start by saying thank you very much to Kelly and to Rachel from the Potter and to Susan for inviting me to speak here today. It's a great honour. And I also want to acknowledge someone else that's in the room from the Potter, Olivia Meehan, who's the academic programs curator here. And Olivia has graciously and wonderfully hosted at least two of my classes now to Susan's wonderful show. And she's shared with them her insights in relation to that show and challenged them to think about what it all means in very unexpected ways. So thank you very much, Olivia. Okay, so my presentation today is really a response to the second part of Susan's show, which we haven't seen that much of. So I'll just set the scene for you. And in her installation piece, she juxtaposes the devastation of the mud volcanic site with the more tranquil landscape of Prawn Fishers Cooperative, and shows the resilience of that cooperative in responding to the aftermath of this disaster. So in this presentation, I want to respond to Susan's work by introducing to you some of the material from my recent book and an associated community archive which I am co-producing to document ritual water and other governance practices in Timor-Leste. So what is the relevance of Timor-Leste to a volcanic mud flow in East Java, I hear you ask? Well, Timor-Leste is a post-conflict country, a country which has emerged from a crisis which of itself produced a particular kind of rupture, not unlike ruptures caused by so-called natural disasters or earthquakes, as we've just heard. In this presentation, I want to look at some of the constraints and possibilities of this rupture, bringing a post-colonial perspective to the issue of disaster and crisis management. My argument that there is something of a twinned human-made disaster in Timor-Leste. The first, the Indonesian occupation and violently destructive withdrawal in 1999, and the second, the less certain but nevertheless problematic example of new and sudden changes sweeping across what is otherwise a locally managed commons concerning water. The socio-cultural practices associated with managing this commons, which were suppressed during the Indonesian occupation, are both re-emergent in the independence era and also arguably at the same time being tacitly suppressed via new entanglements with particular kinds of development imaginaries. So I would like us to consider here how people's capacity to aspire toward their own vision of the future is continually mediated, deferred and disconnected by particular kinds of environmental and outside human intervention. At the same time, drawing on the work of the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, I would like us to consider how the future is in fact being brought into being through culture. And as a result, how we need to pay close attention to the ways in which anticipation and aspiration for the future are culturally embedded and enabled and negotiated. In this, I'm interested in how attention to diverse community archives of local knowledge and practice might enable us to imagine more just and equitable futures. So these archives might come in all sorts of shapes and forms. I am talking to you about one here. Susan's own work can be read as another type of archive, and we'll get to talk about that a bit more later. So I've worked in Timor-Leste for the past 10 years across the central zone of the Balcao and Vakeke districts. It features a mountainous spine of ancient geological uplift, petering down to the lower levels at the coast. This is a map of the hydrogeology of the region. This is a rich karstic zone of water flows and catchments. So underneath the first layer of bedrock is a limestone environment in which the water flows in diffuse and concentrated ways. So this map is based on Timor-Leste, a collaboration between the Timor-Leste government, AusAid and CSIRO, and it was produced on the basis of research carried out in roughly the same 10-year period that I was carrying out my research. The science is based on the understanding of the hydrological cycle and natural catchments. In contrast, I'm interested in social catchments, which, depending on context, may or may not be the same thing. So this is Waikinari, which means in one of the local languages of Waimua, water of the original people. So over this 10-year period, I've been talking to very many people who are connected to particular springs across this landscape because I'm interested in people's social and cultural connections and understandings to water across this region. What in the literature is called the hydrosocial or the hydrocosmological cycle. This spring is the Irabi spring in Watakarabao on the south coast in Vakeke. It is also a place of big water stories, and Irabi means sacred water in Makassai. So all springs across this region will have stories. Some of them are small and some of them are big or more culturally significant. So what I've been doing is following water connections, ancestral trails and spirit beings from the mountainous spine down to the sea on either side of the island. I've also been participating in ritual activities at springs, which are seen in this region as key portals to other worlds. Rituals which seek ancestral blessing for human and agricultural fertility, and particular springs are always linked to particular sacred houses, which are more often founding houses of particular communities. So here I want to draw your attention to a major spring in the area of the Balcao town, where I've done a lot of my work here in Wailia, and its connection to an underground water source, Wailia Bere, some 20 kilometres upland in the drylands of the Balcao Plateau. So these two water sources are connected in an important regional myth of a man travelling underground, emerging in Balcao's Wailia spring, where he marries a local woman. This key springs flow, which is now the town water supply, is said to be dependent on the ritual relationship between these two communities spread across this distance of 20 kilometres and connected through the underground flow. Although the actual myth and the connection between which particular springs, as I found out, changes through time according to changing political and social circumstances. And this map here shows you the local understandings of the flow of water from this underground source on the plateau to connect 4 different communities across the Balkau escarpment area. And yet this understanding of this 4-pronged flow is quite different to the understanding that the scientists came to. When they first began their research, they understood this water to be flowing in a more linear direction. Yet ongoing hydrological research is also coming to understand Balkau's karst aquifer as much more complicated than first thought across both time and space. And I think this is an interesting example of scientific certainty over time changing into more and more uncertainty and becoming perhaps more flexible as in local understandings of this complex waterscape. So when the scientists first put their dyes into the springs, they found that the water travelled from that underground source on the plateau to this spring of Wailili on the escarpment edge, which is another important spring complex and ritual centre in the sub-district, but they only sampled the waters in over a 6-month period, and local people connected to these waters were very sceptical that they hadn't in fact captured the full picture. So one of these local people is this man who's the ritual custodian of the spring, the Wailiabere underground spring, and this is his sacred house there on the plateau. He has now died. He was one of my key informants, and he shared with me many stories about the significance of this water source, who the water is shared with, and the ritual practices which have to be undertaken in order to ensure that it's distributed correctly. I now work with his son, who is now known as the Bear Nine, or the custodian of the water. Here's another man from the town itself, who's a senior ritual leader, shown here dressed in full regalia, who has also over many years shared with me cryptic origin stories, migration stories, language diffusion stories, all mediated through deep and complex metaphysical understandings of water and fire, connecting people to people, people to their environment, and people to the ancestral realm. So I arrived in Balkau wanting to understand people's connections with water, and I realised, and the way that they managed it, and I realised I couldn't understand any of that until I first got to know all these other aspects. Here's another ritual community close to Balkau called the Waniuma community, who are now in the process of rebuilding their sacred house connected to their own spring complex in the region. Something I should say is that during the Indonesian occupation, most of the sacred houses across the country, and particularly in this area, were destroyed during that occupation. And it's only now in the independence era that people have been able to rebuild these houses, which are very ritually complicated undertakings, and that rebuilding itself has enabled a reflourishing of these rituals connected to water and other environmental governance relations. This is another further example of that. These 2 men are known locally as the Kabul Bay, or the water controllers, who are connected to the workings of spring-fed irrigation channels, which are managed by customary farmers' cooperatives, and they manage the water that leads down from this central Wailea spring in the town down to the sea and feeds cascading rice fields down along the way. So from what they tell me, rice in this region is very old. It's pre-colonial, they say, which goes against the received wisdom of the agricultural science industry in East Timor at the moment. But what their local oral histories show and reflect, they tell the stories of the arrival of rice cultures and the activation of irrigation practices at particular springs. This is another site in the region, Ponte Bondura, which is an extremely significant site for the Balkau sub-district, connected to the story of Jaulere, which recounts the colonial history of the region from a local perspective, and again is embedded in this understanding of the hydrosocial cycle. Not the kind of story you get from reading the Dutch or Portuguese archives that are available on the region. And just to the west of here, in Waiwanu and Kaisido, there is the site of a proposed $400 million cement factory and mining operation, which proposes to dig up the karst, which I've just been speaking to you about for the last 10 minutes or so. It's not known what the implications of this will be for the groundwater and people's connections to and dependence on springs across this zone. Other issues surrounding the water management in this post-colonial, post-conflict landscape relate to the burgeoning pressure on the town's water supply. As the urban area has grown in the colonial and independence time, there's huge pressures on the town's water supply. Even the hospital doesn't have enough water. There are many illegal connections as people tap into these above-ground pipes that run up from the spring to try to feed the town's water resources. And I argue in my book that one of the reasons for this is the colonial era breakdown and indeed ongoing independence era breakdown of local civic water cultures of the kind I've just been describing to you. So in the 1960s, the Portuguese removed the sacred house from this particular spring and put in place a pump station, which is now the town's water supply. Yet authorities have never really engaged with its ritual significance to the local community, even despite the fact that this structure here in the foreground is one of the ancestral graves of the founder of Balcao from distant times. Yet private water contractors who continue to truck water around Balcao town even today because of this inadequate supply do recognise the custodial roles of those responsible for managing these springs and pay an amount of money to the custodians of the springs for taking waters from these particular places. So it's interesting to note that the formal governance structures won't recognise these custodial relationships, but private contractors will. So as I mentioned, customary governance practices are resurgent across East Timor today. And this is a water ritual being carried out in the central mountain zone of Malbisi. In Balcao, community rituals at springs are slowly re-emerging. These are complicated undertakings, as I was saying. And this slide shows a house-based ritual at a spring, which is tied in with a rice or a maize harvest. So these individual house-based rituals are continuing to occur. Community-based rituals are coming back more slowly. And that is happening as a result of the fact that these houses are now being able to be rebuilt across the country. And as the houses are rebuilt and the sacred house complexes are completed, that enables a new ritual flourishing in which people are able to come together to manage their spring waters and other environmental resources. So as I've been saying, I've been producing a digital oral history archive in relation to these stories. I've collected video stories from elders who speak in their own words, in their own languages. I've got a representative slice of 7 languages so far in the archive. It contains information on specific springs, connections to sacred houses, other stories and relevant published documents. It shows local practices and the import of this for water governance. Meanwhile, billions of dollars of aid is poured into water and sanitation projects, monitoring, evaluation and scientific research. Yet there's the critical blind spot is that most of these activities, in most cases, overlook the interests, rights and traditional entitlements of constituent customary communities and thereby fail to consider how their pre-existing bodies of knowledge, institutions and practice may contribute to the local and regional governance regimes, especially in the context of future anthropogenic climate change and associated extreme weather events. I think I'm probably over time, so I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much. They were very, very rich and very different interpretations of the landscape. I was just going to see if I can draw the 3 of you out with one probably improbable question and then open the floor to discussion and other questions. The thing that struck me about the 3 talks was that they were 3 very different forms of bearing witness to what happens to landscapes and 3 very different ways of interpreting human interactions. The scientific one, very distantiated, very rational. It's one way of producing a sense of a landscape in which the Anthropocene is writ large. It is about human interaction, with the agency pretty indistinct. Lisa's discussion is much more about a post-colonial, post-conflict agency in which you can point to particular actors being responsible for particular outcomes, but there's also a very powerful contrast between traditional interpretations, cultural interpretations of the landscape, and the new forms of bearing witness, in particular the scientific interpretations, the Lodin. And then there's Susan's artistic interpretation, which brings a wholly different content to the landscape, a much more emotional one, a much more powerfully visual one, obviously. Just wondering how you three reconcile these different narratives. This is the easy question. How do you think about these different types of bearing witness? To what extent are they reconcilable? To what extent are they cooperative? To what extent do they actually offer different and conflictual interpretations of how we live in the landscape? There's an easy one to start with.
Yeah, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. Is that a microphone?
It's alive.
Oh, it's alive. Okay. I think it's really interesting in relationship to the Lucy Mud Volcano because, in fact, it's a site that, well, you could say that area actually has a whole history of mud volcanoes, and also it was an agricultural area and also highly populated, but there were obviously rivers and tributaries and other and shrimp farmers and fishermen in the area. So, I mean, you know, you have a whole history, an indigenous history that seemed to be ultimately disregarded. And whether that, it's not only in terms of greed and progress and mismanagement, but I also think too that we're talking about a problem that repeats itself pretty much all over the world, I think, in various, whether it's a post-colonial or post-conflict situations where the Indigenous voice is not heard.
And from my perspective, obviously, I've taken quite a scientific approach, but being so personally affected by the earthquakes and working in all spaces and living through it, I could have taken a very different approach, possibly. What I would say is that, you know, we do science in order to try to inform the issues around how to have a happy life and a safe life and all these sort of things. But it doesn't matter how good our science is, we're not at the stage where we're dictating how we respond to this sort of work. So what I mean by that is often it's up to the community to decide what to do with the sort of scientific evidence that we are presenting to them. Or it's up for politicians and policymakers to try to grapple with the kind of data that we're providing them with. And in the context of Christchurch, you know, there were people who were told that their chance of dying in rock falls triggered by earthquakes was greater than 1 in a 10,000 year per year. So we call that an annual individual fatality risk. And those people were told that that's probably too dangerous as a society that we would accept, and their land was purchased, and they were given some money to move on to live somewhere else, somewhere more safer. And so I guess the role of science in that case is some of the data I've shown there is to say, we know rocks can fall off there. These are how many we would expect. These are the velocities. This is what would happen to your house or would happen to you if you were hit by one of these rocks. These are the sort of triggers we think for causing rocks. This is our best models of future seismicity. Here's the situation as we see it scientifically, but people have different risk thresholds. And so maybe a 1 in 1,000 year chance of dying is acceptable to some people in this room, whereas others might take a more cautious approach. And that kind of transcends the science that gets into a much more complicated type scenario. So,
but also, what about in terms of Christchurch? It was, in terms of Maori, they were always sort of saw that as a swamp, and that they, in fact, actually would not live there anyway.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you have all that history, which unfortunately in many parts of the world has been completely obliterated.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened in Japan and very much so with Lucy Mud Volcano as well. Like, I think that's, in a sense, that was another aspect, which is a whole other dimension to going back to the Lucy Mud Volcano, was Hardy Presetto was trying to establish a geopark. And there's actually a geopark in New Zealand, I think, as well, which is the idea of attracting historical knowledge and scientific knowledge, ecotourism around, geological sites that have been affected by earthquakes or whatever. But it's also the idea of it's ratified by UNESCO and United Nations. It's a way of actually dealing with the past as well, so that, in terms of, say, the Lucy Mud Volcano, why in fact were they drilling in such a so volatile area? Also with Christchurch, in terms of, or even in terms of Fukushima, or even in terms of Samoa, the people actually never lived by the coast. So you're also dealing with the way in which there's a sort of inability to deal with that information from the past, or hasn't been recognised. But maybe Lisa can talk better about this.
Well, I guess I would just say, in relation to Peter's original question, that I think we're all talking around this kind of very interesting area of a nature-culture continuum, and in some ways we're telling similar stories but in very different ways. And I really appreciated, Mark, your story of these natural processes and the human intervention in those natural processes. But I think what the aesthetic and the ethnographic intervention does for that story is go a little bit further in kind of moving us away from, there's still a sense of the uncontrollable there. There's the human influence on these natural processes, but it's like, what do you do with it after it's happened? And I think Susan's work and what I tried to show in my presentation is about the resilience of those human communities to respond and intervene into those moments of rupture and take some kind of possibility, make something of the possibilities that arise from those circumstances. So it's, about very much seeing not just nature's agency, but also human agency in these processes, in communication with the natural agency. So it's Peter framed this session around saying that it was all connected to the Anthropocene, but sometimes I think these ideas of the Anthropocene and anthropogenic climate change, they can lead us with a very kind of totalizing view of the world, a very a view that, not defeatist view, a very resigned view. And I think what this aesthetic and ethnographic approach to this human culture continuum can bring is a kind of very differentiated and differently scaled understanding of human approaches to this moment.
Well, I think it's interesting, though, where you get these sort of forms of ruptures like, say, Fukushima or Lucy Mud Volcano, where basically you have Japan Inc., right? It has been seen since the sort of 60s, like a sort of corporation, so to speak. And I think in a way what happened with their technology failing with Fukushima created such profound shame in Japan. It was extraordinary because I think that, they thought that their technology, even though it mightn't have been upgraded or sort of, but nevertheless, actually, there was a certain degree of pride in that, and but then in that process, it also sort of revealed that the majority of people in Japan didn't even know that there were so many nuclear power plants on their own island. It's amazing how the media works as well, how sort of how people control poverty and how all the different forms of poverty in our culture, in education and. I think it's, but it's interesting that somehow these forces, or whether it's man-made or natural, that has created this amazing ruptures, also sort of, create a much larger conversation as well, generally about how we are going to survive and how, as a human species, into the future.